there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector, not just a tax collector, and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone to be a guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost." So how can we apply this incident? Well, maybe the question could be asked, whose disapproval are we willing to accept in terms of people we may choose to socialize with? And also thinking that a person who is financially well off may be lonely, still be lonely and isolated and in need of friendship. Often you assume that if a person has money, they have lots of friends. Not necessarily the case, is it? The Good Samaritan is another important scriptural example of hospitality. Now, okay, you're saying he doesn't sit and eat with him, he doesn't take him to his house. Okay, yes. It's not your typical hospitality, but it's a kind of hospitality. I mean, it's the kind of hospitality you would show if you stop by the side of the road to help someone who was broken down. I mean, that's a reaching out. There's an inviting someone into your time, your space, your resources, your time. And so kindness and hospitality to very needy strangers is represented by this story. And you notice how it's introduced, though. But the rich young ruler wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" In reply, Jesus said, and so he tells the whole story. We don't need to read it all now. But we know that what happens is that the person who is least likely to be considered religiously superior is the one that stops and helps. And he not only helps him then, but he provides money so that the care of the man can continue on in his absence. He says to the innkeeper, second last line on the screen there now, "Look after him," he said, "and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have." So this story, I think, teaches something about the concepts of neighbor and stranger. Who is my neighbor? So neighbor and stranger seem like opposite poles, right? Well, the neighbor is someone you know pretty well, or it's assumed that you have a proximity to them, physical at least, if not in terms of socialization. Stranger, the opposite assumption applies. But here, the very desperation of the man's plight seems to make him unlikely to be a neighbor, and certainly the Samaritan has never seen him before, has no knowledge of him. But Jesus told the story in response to the question, "Who is my neighbor?" It is our love for God that leads us to care for our neighbor, Nouwen says. It is in God that we find our neighbors and discover our responsibility to them. We might even say that it is only in God that our neighbor becomes our neighbor rather than an infringement on our autonomy. It's an interesting point of view, isn't it? Only in God our neighbor becomes our neighbor. But thinking of the unknown stranger, of course, and bring up that sort of scary-looking image I had on the previous screen, we realize that there's this obstacle of fear. Hospitality to the unknown stranger is frequently prevented by the obstacle of fear. Our fearfulness, surprisingly, can be seen as a kind of hostility. Again, this is Nouwen. I'm relying heavily on Henry Nouwen in a lot of these points. He says it prevents us from reaching out to strangers, from embracing them and inviting them into our world. And he creates a continuum, hostility on one end and hospitality on the other. And the movement has to be from hostility, in other words, a sense of the otherness of the other person, a strong sense that they are other than ourselves, to the open-heartedness of hospitality. And so that's the movement, the continuum that has to exist between hostility and hospitality. Our society seems to be increasingly full of fearful, defensive, aggressive people anxiously clinging to their property and inclined to look at their surrounding world with suspicion. But still, that is our vocation, to convert the enemy into the guest and to create the free and fearless space where brotherhood and sisterhood can be formed and fully experienced. Now we come to the issue of space, creating a free and friendly space. A welcoming space, emotionally, is one that has to have a certain amount of emptiness. Emptiness in a certain sense. When we have become sensitive to the painful contours of hostility, we can start identifying the lines of the opposite to which we are called to move, hospitality. The German word for hospitality is Gastfreundschaft, and then the Dutch word is somewhat similar. One means friendship of the guest, and the Dutch word Gastvrijheid means freedom of the guest. And so the idea of freedom, or creating a unthreatening space for the visitor, is included in both those definitions. Hospitality means primarily the creation of free space where the stranger can enter and become a friend instead of an enemy. So it has to be an empty space in some sense. The paradox of hospitality is that it wants to create emptiness, not a fearful emptiness, but a friendly emptiness where strangers can enter and discover themselves created free. Hospitality is not a subtle invitation to adopt our lifestyle, but the gift of a chance for the guest to find his own identity affirmed within our space. Creating space is hard work. All kinds of things make forceful demands and tend to fill every possible empty corner of our lives. And so it's hard for us to have empty space in that sense. And it's hard for us to create empty space in the sense of empty space in conversation. Empty space where nothing is being said, and then you feel like you have to keep bringing up topics of conversation, because for the host, in the empty space of that sort tends to create fear. And then being busy is an occupied space that's become a status symbol. And so one thing that can, I think, be very threatening and non-freeing for the guest is when you talk about how you manage to fit in this hospitality between all the other things you have to do, to let them know how generous you are with your time, to squeeze it in, you know. And anything that hints of that is suggesting that your space is very much an occupied space. There's not real freedom for them to be in that space. The hosts then often feel they have to fill up every empty corner and occupy every moment. And thus hospitality becomes oppressing for the guests rather than freeing. And then Naumann goes on and talks about two different kinds of problem, two things that work against the right kind of empty space. And that's occupied space and preoccupied space. So preoccupation is an even greater problem than occupation, our busyness. Preoccupation includes our preoccupations, our preconceptions, our self-focus or preformed expectations. And that sort of goes back to what we talked about in the first class, where we talked about our expectations of the role of host and guest, which may be very different from those of our guest. So our preconceptions. Our attentiveness to the events that make up our own lives makes our guests and their events incomprehensible and uninteresting to us so often, right? Our attentiveness to our own events, so we're preoccupied in that sense. Instead, we should learn to honor the individuality or strangeness of the people who become our guests. Creating free and empty friendly space then is easiest when it's people who are new in our social environment who we think may become our friends. Again, this is part of our preconception, right? You have preconceptions, you invite certain people you think, well, they may become our friends. It's hard is when the people we know are just passing through. Sometimes they're passing through, you'll never see them again, you don't really know that. But when you're aware that people are just temporarily in the area and you offer them hospitality, or for other reasons, they may seem unlikely to become your friends, and it's harder then to really create that free, empty, and welcoming space. Creating the right sort of empty space will often require accepting and respecting off-putting individuality, strangeness of some sort. So the stranger may indeed be a strange person. You've often run into that. We work from loneliness and hostility. More about loneliness a little later, but this is part of how now one's thinking on the subject of hospitality. We work from loneliness and hostility to solitude and hospitality, losing our defensiveness and becoming free to embrace others. So hospitality is countercultural in that it bestows recognition and dignity on the stranger. Christine Pohl says, Christian hospitality has always had a subversive, countercultural dimension. Hospitality is resistance. When the larger culture disregards or dishonors certain persons, small acts of respect and welcome are potent far beyond themselves. They point to a different system of valuing and an alternate model of relationships. People view hospitality as quaint and tame, people meaning of the world today, partly because they do not understand the power of recognition. In Matthew 25:31-46 of scripture we touched on at the beginning of the class, we have that startling and crucial text, a parable that you hardly ever hear a sermon on, the sheep and the goats. And the people who showed hospitality were told they did it unto Christ, and the people who didn't were told they didn't do it unto Christ. And in both cases, the people do not recognize that Christ was involved in the situation. My mouse is not working right at the moment. Yeah, both groups will instantly, simultaneously respond in a similar way. Lord, when did we see you? And respond that way. And so that is a text about recognition and misrecognition, not seeing Christ in a situation when actually the ministry that was done to Christ. The ministry that was not done was a kind of rejection of Christ. The connection between particular needy persons and Jesus comes as a total surprise in this parable. Recognizing dignity as well as need was stressed by John Chrysostom, the early church father. He said, in warning his congregation to show excessive joy when offering hospitality in order to avoid shaming the recipient. And these exact words were quoted by Christine Pohl. The stranger requires much attendance, much encouragement. And with all this, if it is difficult for him not to feel abashed, for so delicate is his position that whilst he receives the favor, he is ashamed. That shame we ought to remove by the most attentive service and to show by words and actions that we do not think we are conferring a favor, but receiving one. And Paul goes on, this was no false performance. In the economy of God, the host was both obliged and blessed in giving hospitality. And so a comment from Nouwen at another point in his discussion is that guests are carrying special gifts with them. And that ties in with the whole idea of some having entertained angels unawares, doesn't it? There could be a special blessing that we're not expecting. So now we go on to the second topic for today, and that is approaching intimacy. And it's important, I think, to see how honoring individuality precedes approaching intimacy. In other words, real relationship, real communication with people. real communication with the Spirit of God. And so 2 key scriptures, of course, the breaking of bread at Holy Communion, the connectedness to Christ we experience in that, and a key passage we'll look at in this part of the class, he was known to them in the breaking of the bread, which of course is the story of the 2 on the road to Emmaus after Christ's resurrection. Sorry, my phone is ringing. That's, I'm hearing it, but you're not hearing, fortunately, but hearing in my ears distracting me. So a key idea is that the sharing of food functions both literally and symbolically to draw us out of our loneliness and into relationship with one another and with Christ. The importance of food in Scripture, both literally and symbolically, I don't need to spend very much time on, but you can just think of many of these as I flick through them. The fruit of the forbidden tree, so many of these Old Testament stories, a lot of commandments about food to the people of Israel in Leviticus, Daniel's food choices, and then Jesus' miracles involving food and feeding the disciples, parables about food. The Emmaus Road story we'll look at closely. Peter's vision of unclean food in the book of Acts, the heavenly banquet. All these are examples of key, important references to and uses of the symbolism of food. So looking at food through the lens of the Bible, Melissa Durabian, whose work we'll look at a lot in this section, says this: food invites us into God's creation, is the cornerstone of hospitality, guides us into compassion, reminds us to slow down, is a source of delight and connection, is an opportunity to lean into our dependence on God, and motivates us to accept ourselves and the oneness of humankind or creature kind. Food fuels far more than our bodies. It drives ministry, marks celebrations, and connects us to our true selves, to one another, and to God Himself. So feeding others connects us with God through creativity. There's a kind of imitation of God's nurturing and God's provision as creator in providing food. God is our provider and nurturer. God's provision, so many phrases that refer to His provision have to do with food. He prepares a table before me. Jesus saying, I'm the bread of life. He shall feed His flock. All these things are ways in which the act of feeding is connected to God as provider. And creativity is a connection with what it means to be made in the image of God. Now, some people have made more of this idea than others. One of the things Dorothy L. Sayers, who I did a lot of research on, did my dissertation on, was very strong on, was that the idea that when God said, let us make man in our own image, what did He mean? What is God revealed to be at that point in the story of the Scriptures? And that is, He is a creator. So there's a limit to how far you can push that analogy. Doesn't mean that creative people are closer to God than people who have no creativity. I don't think we would want to say that. But I think it depends on how broadly you define creativity. Be able to make something, to be able to imaginatively connect with people, to be able to see beyond the literal. There's a kind of creativity in any kind of spiritual functioning. And so depending on how you define creativity, I think you would say that that is what it means to be made in the image of God and to be following a pattern laid down for us by God. Creating will bring us closer to God, both because it pleases Him and because we get to emulate God in Genesis. Anytime we create, Durabian says, anytime we do something that adds value to our earth, we get a tiny glimpse of what God was doing early in Genesis. So nurturing, showing God's love to people by feeding them. Now, this is pretty much a maternal thing, isn't it? And it seems to be kind of instinctive, although not all women enjoy putting food on the table, but it tends to be more something that you see as part of you, who you are, whether you like it or not. But it can be something righteous. It doesn't have to be. Depending on your attitude and your way of doing it. But that maternal and instinctive impulse, because it's maternal and because it's instinctive, doesn't mean that there's nothing righteous about it. But it doesn't mean that there has to be either. But certainly we see, as you can see this well-known picture there, you probably recognize the painting of a Thanksgiving meal by Norman Rockwell. It's like the epitome of a certain kind of home life, traditional, precious, almost sacred kind of gathering. And so you have all these opportunities for nurturing people, the family meal, the dinner party, the stranger. What part does love play in each type of shared meal? In each of those, there might not be much love at all in the occasion, but there could be a great deal. An invitation to authenticity. Melissa the Arabian speaks about her own experiences in this book, and I want to tell you a little bit about it in a moment, but she says, God invites us to enter into the freedom of being who we are. An invitation to authenticity is the name of one of her chapters. All of her chapters in the book are an invitation to something. And she says, God invites us to enter into the freedom of being who we are, then leaving the results of our work up to Him. And so if we feed others with a particular intention, with the intention of sharing God's creation, God's invitation to authenticity will lead us to tasting His grace. So she speaks on nurturing. I actually want to get out the book. I should have taken that before. So I want to share something that she shares about herself. This book is one that I found by looking, first of all, for an audio book that I would enjoy listening to that wasn't fiction, and found this Christian one. And as soon as I started listening to it, I thought, oh, I have to order that. And as you can see, I got a used copy that was a library copy. It's a story of a very successful cook, but whose life was overshadowed by God's provision. She talks about, caring for your love and your family in a way that images God's provision, shown in these lines from Psalm 65, God's harvest presence. In the last line there, you crown the year with your bounty and your carts overflow with abundance. So we are better able to nurture others when we tune into how God uses food to nurture us. So in this book, Tasting Grace, she makes the point that a good cook is not necessarily a nurturer, and a nurturer is not necessarily a good cook. The story of her life is quite striking. She starts off in poverty as a child. Her mom was a single mom, divorced when Melissa was just a few months old, and they were very poor. Her mother was actually putting her way through medical school, saving money to put her way through medical school, but Melissa and her sister didn't have enough to eat. They were really hungry. And one of her first experiences of the importance of food was, going to school with no money for a lunch, and the lunch ladies realizing that she had no money and figuring out that letting her work in the cafeteria was the best way of letting her get a free lunch. And so just enjoying food, she talks about that, from the earliest time of her life. And then tragically, her mother actually does become a doctor. But in the meantime, her mother and her have a very close relationship. Her mother, when she did get a little money, even before she finished medical school, would always have folks over to eat. And Melissa just enjoyed so much her mother's entertaining and opening their home to other people. But then her mother, very inexplicably, right after a time of shopping for a prom dress with Melissa when Melissa was in college, committed suicide. She was a successful doctor, working at a hospital in Washington, D.C. She commits suicide. So Melissa, of course, fell apart. She lost her faith. She did have quite a bit of faith throughout her early life, but then she of course, had a period of darkness there. But it went on to have success in finances. She got her MBA, and she worked actually for Disney, first in the US, and then got a job in France for Disney in Paris. And began to come back to her faith more strongly, and met a guy from Provence. What better for someone interested in food? Marries a guy from Provence. In the meantime, she's been cooking a lot for her friends. Always enjoyed cooking for her friends, having dinner parties, and of course meeting her husband's family, learning about the cooking in Provence. She gets better and better at it, and goes back to the U.S. He goes to grad school in the U.S., and she goes on the Food Network show and wins out the Bake Off, a new Food Network show, and so she had her own TV program a couple of different times. So around this time, she recovered her mother's recipe box. Her mother's death had been something that she didn't collect all the pieces from, but her mother's mother had. Her grandmother was still alive, living out west. Melissa was on the East Coast at this time, and her grandmother contacted her and said, "I have your mother's recipe box here if you'd like to have it." Melissa was very busy with young children and her TV show, and her husband said, I'll go out and get it, and I'll bring it back. And he transcribed all the recipes. And Melissa was thinking, all her life that I have become a cook because my mother was such a cook, such an entertainer. And so I'm going to get my mother's recipe box, and it's really going to fulfill all my images of what my mother was. And she got such a disappointment and shock, because the recipes were these weird old things, like 3 different recipes for broccoli cheese casserole, and all these things with, all these things made with canned soup, and this one strange thing called Libby's dip that had hard-boiled eggs and chopped pickle and olives and shredded cheese, and it sounded so weird. And she thought, my mother wasn't a good cook. Well, how did I become a good cook? I thought I was following from my mother. And she started thinking about it, and she said, I was following from my mother. But the best things, I just want to read you this part. But I wonder what would have happened if I discovered earlier that Mom truly wasn't an accomplished cook. Would I have pursued a career doing something that I clearly had no natural genetic disposition or natural talent for? For whatever reason, her treasured, unambitious recipe box came to me long after it was too late for me to turn back. I'd already spent several seasons creating $10 dinners on Food Network, and I'd already published my first cookbook. My mom's work was already done. I became the cook she would never be, not in spite of, but maybe even because of the woman she was and because of God's timing. I believe my mom's heart influenced me way more than her skills in the kitchen. Turns out the work and care of preparing food for others is as important as the food itself, perhaps more so. Those we welcome to our tables care far more about our welcome than what we offer them on their plates. Maybe you consider yourself an average cook who doesn't order exotic spices from online or make meals that look like they came from a Michelin-starred restaurant. Perhaps you even face 5 p.m. on a Tuesday with a certain amount of dread and make the boring old favorite while your children roll their eyes. I'd like to offer some encouragement. Keep cooking, keep feeding those you love, and keep sharing with new friends. Keep inviting friends, family, and strangers to your table and serve them the weird Libby dips of the world. And so I just found that such a precious thing, because here's a woman who found out a lot about being a great cook, but she also found out some things that were far more important in her spiritual journey. And so she realized what her heritage really was. A good hostess, a nurturer, need not be a good cook, just a loving one. 3 movements of the spiritual life that now one talks about. This is also a little complex, but I think it's really worth listening to. It's in the book Reaching Out. He talks about an inward, an outward, and an upward movement. And that concept helps us understand hospitality as an approach to intimacy. The inward movement is from loneliness to solitude. So he starts off talking about we all have this inherent loneliness. And it's not something that we have to go into denial about, but it's something that as we understand ourselves better, becomes a kind of solitude where we meet God. So that loneliness is transformed spiritually as in our spiritual growth into more of a state of solitude. And then the outward movement, our relationship to other people, has to move from hostility to hospitality. We've already noticed that movement. And then the upward movement is becoming at peace with ourselves and with others so that we can come into a deeper relationship with God. And so there's more direct discussion of it here as we move inward to a place of self-awareness, repentance, forgiveness, and humility. Our loneliness or forlornness is transformed into a receptive solitude, peaceful self-knowledge, and self-worth. From this place of peace, we begin to move outward by reaching out to others, as fear and hostility give place to receptivity and hospitality. These movements lead to the third movement, which is upward, Godward, as we gain the courage to reach heavenward, seeking God, who is the source and goal of all aspects of life. And then this was the most surprising thing of all for me in all the research that I did. And after understanding pretty well, I think, what Nouwen was talking about when he spoke about empty space. And the whole idea going along with that was being non-confrontational, surely, although he hadn't used that word. And then he starts talking about confrontation. I'm thinking, what? Intimacy requires confrontation. Confrontation in the sense of representing Christ to our guests. Relationship between solitude, emptiness, and confrontation is that you knowing who you are and creating that open, empty space for your guests doesn't preclude and actually requires a representation to them of what your life is about, who you are, what grows out of your solitude, and of course your relationship with God. The silence of solitude is nothing but dead silence when it does not make us alert to a new voice sounding from beyond all human chatter. Hospitality leads only to a congested home when nobody is traveling anywhere. Receptivity, creating empty space, is only one side of hospitality. Real receptivity requires that we define who we are to the guest. The other side is equally important. Confrontation. To be receptive to the stranger in no way implies we have to become neutral nobodies. When we want to be really hospitable, we have to not only receive strangers, but also to confront them with an unambiguous presence. No real dialogue is possible between somebody and a nobody. So there's an interesting paradox there, isn't it? You know, you don't confront your guest, you do confront your guest. You know, you don't assert who you are, you do let it be known who you are. You know, there's so many paradoxes in spiritual things, isn't there? And so these ideas about our relationship with the guest then tie in with our relationship to God, because the two dimensions of intimacy are in feeding others and eating with others. As Christians, we approach intimacy with them and with Christ. So the intimacy that Jesus reestablishes with his disciples after his resurrection, and there's 3 incidents that we want to think about, but actually one of them we looked at last week, and that was the feeding of with the food that he prepared at the beach when they were fishing. But then there's two others, and it's interesting that in these three instances, there was food involved in all of them in that reestablishing of intimacy. And this one, as they were talking about these things, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace to you." But they were startled and frightened and thought they saw a spirit. And he said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts arise in your hearts? See my hands and feet, that it is I. Touch me and see." And then if you go down, we'll just go down to the last three lines. He says to them, "Have you anything to eat?" Does Jesus need to eat after he's resurrected? It's interesting, isn't it? Have you anything to eat? And they gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it before them. I guess part of it is to show the nature of the resurrected body. It's still a physical body, but it's also a kind of intimacy, isn't it? He ate it before them. And then that beautiful story of the road to Emmaus. I'm not going to put the whole thing on, but the first part you'll remember is two of the disciples. And the disciples are not named in this, so it seems like they may not have been two of the 12, although they may have been, but they're not named in this incident. But anyway, they're walking along and they're talking about the events of Jesus. Yes? Yeah, I can see the time on the clock down there. Cliff's time telling me the time. And they're talking about the events that have taken place, and Jesus joins them and begins talking with them, and their eyes are veiled. And they don't recognize who he is. And they go down to the village where they're going. He acts as if he was going farther, but they urge him to stay. So he goes in to stay with them. And while he was at table with them, he took the bread and blessed it and brake it and gave it to them. And their eyes were open, and they recognized him. And he vanished from their sight. And they said to each other, "Did not our hearts burn within us while he was talking to us on the road and while he opened to us the scriptures?" And then they go to Jerusalem right away, even though it's late in the day, and tell the other disciples what happened and how he was known to them in the breaking of the bread. And so why was he known to them at that point? In the breaking of the bread. It was a point of intimacy, wasn't it? The breaking of the bread. They had seen him do it before. Can this sharing of food and the blessing of it be for us a point at which Christ becomes known in a special way to us and our guests? And the blessing of it, maybe as we say, blessing or grace over the meal. Can this be a point when Christ becomes known even with our families and with our guests? So my last point, other than the points for discussion, which I'm leaving with you, is what Nouwen said about hospitality overall. In our culture, the concept of hospitality has lost much of its power and is often used in circles where we are more prone to expect a watered-down piety than a serious search for authentic Christian spirituality. But still, if there is any term worth restoring to its original depth and evocative potential, it is the concept of hospitality. It is one of the richest biblical terms. It can deepen and broaden our insight in our relationship to our fellow human beings. And so then there's a number of points to ponder, which are most are on your question sheet. So we have probably about 3 minutes for a little bit of discussion if you have some point you'd like to raise. I'm sorry I had to, again, move very quickly last week because we were so late getting started with the technical problems, and today because I was squeezing 2 topics into one class, but I was able to include most of the important things, I think. But anything you'd like to raise or ask about? Yeah.
I thought it was so interesting the etymology of the German word and the Dutch word.
Yeah.
And forgive me if you already talked about this, but the etymology of hospitality itself, do we know the history of that word or where it comes from?
I think caring, I know that the word hospital in medieval times was for any charitable institution. So, hospital and hospitality obviously come from the same root of caring, ministering to people in some way. Not necessarily just giving them food. It's broader than that. It's a caring ministry kind of thing.
And one more just quick question. Henry Nouwen, those 3 things, they were loneliness to solitude, hostility to hospitality, and I missed the last one. What was the upward?
Well, upward towards God. Well,
Godward.
yeah, I don't think it was a continuum presented for that one. Yeah, the book is Reaching Out. It's a wonderful book, as of course are all. These are just some questions that I have on the sheet. Anything else? Somebody else comment? Something? Well, I think it's time for the service, but I have extra copies of the handouts from the first 2 times that we met. So if you want those, I have extras here I brought with me. Some people asked about them before.